We'll go ahead and get started. I'll be driving her slides for the moment. So I'm Derek Konekis. I'm a faculty member in environmental studies, if I haven't met you already. It's my honor today to introduce Beth Gibbons. She's the executive director of the American Society of Adaptation Professionals. So ASAP is our nation's leading professional association dedicated to supporting and connecting professionals working in the adaptation field. Founded in 2011 with the goal of building a space for folks working in different sectors on different issues related to climate. ASAP has a lot of activities. I'm sure Beth will go over some of these as well. But among those, it runs the National Adaptation Forum, which several of our students have attended in the past. They have member-led working groups on specific topical areas. And they also have a student mentorship program, which I would highlight. We've had some of our ES students actually participate in it, including Miles Gordon, who just landed a great job as a wildfire program analyst for the California Public Utilities Commission. So in short, it remains one of our nation's most dynamic and innovative organizations out there, looking at how do we address on a day-to-day level practical applications in adaptation. So as executive director, Beth brings about a little over a decade of experience in sustainable development and climate. Prior to joining ASAP, she directed the University of Michigan's Climate Center and also managed NOAA's Great Lakes Regional Integrated Science and Assessment Center. Beth also served in Peace Corps in Togo and holds a master's in urban planning from the University of Michigan. Let's admit people here. Sorry, there we go. So she has a presentation about how long you want to go, Beth?
You know, I don't want to talk for more than 30 minutes, and I don't know that my slides will take that long, but if I get close to it, feel free to shake a hook at me. And if you want it to be, I thought I'd talk for about 30 minutes. And if you want it to be shorter, it can be shorter. I'm really interested in the conversation. And that's my expectation.
So
we can work
everybody feel free to interrupt. We're all about this being a conversation rather than a presentation. So if you have a question somewhere, feel free to either raise your hand or just kind of speak up loudly and clearly. Keep it short and brief, but we'd like this to be as conversational as possible to at least get close to simulating what we might have in a room. Otherwise, I think I will start the slides. Beth, you're welcome to introduce any other information you want on yourself or ASAP activities. And with no further ado.
Yeah, well, you pull those up. I appreciate the introduction. In addition to the background that Derek provided, I had a previous career before I got into climate change adaptation and resilience, working on international development, which really I use quite a bit in this work that I do. And I think of myself first as a community development person. Spent a long time trying to understand build social cohesion. I worked on that before I knew there was a jargon word that I could call it. I thought it was just how you get to know your neighbors. I live in Ypsilanti, Michigan, which is in Southeast Michigan. It is a town of 20,000 people, an old forest town, also the home of Willow Run, which is where all the B-24s rolled off the line, and the home of Rosie the Riveter, a community that has an incredible amount of grit and gumption, and also a lot of segregation and justice and housing justice challenges that it's facing. I serve on the Sustainability Commission here in Ypsi, which I've found to be really enlightening and good for me as somebody who practices at the national level, to then have a really firm grounding in my own community's experience with climate adaptation and resilience, and what that means for a community that has a lot of challenges and pressures and very, very little capacity. I also serve on the National Advisory Board for the University of Michigan's Climate and Space Science program, working to ensure that we're building a future cohort of applied climate scientists who can take their training and actually make it useful for policy and decision making. And I just mentioned that because it's sort of a passion of mine, aside from the climate adaptation and service work, which I generally support through ASAP, understanding how we bring sciences into this interdisciplinary space. So I really enjoy that position on NAB. So the title of my presentation today, and hopefully this will come together by the end, is Building a Cohesive Climate Adaptation Field. This is the mission of ASAP. We are trying to advance adaptation and resilience in such a way that we are building a field of practice. And if you want to go to the next slide, Derek. I'll talk a bit about climate adaptation and resilience intro. I'm sure none of you will need this, but I can't help myself basically to build up a momentum into the rest of the presentation from giving it. I'll provide a little ASAP intro, and then we'll dive somewhat deeper into some programs and our knowledge resources at ASAP. I'm going to touch on emerging trends, about the private sector role that the private climate adaptation marketplace is playing in resilience work. And then I'm going to share some about our emerging programs, specifically around in-migration and climate migration more generally, what that looks like and why ASAP is engaging in it. And then hopefully we'll have time for a discussion. We want to go to the next slide. So, what is climate adaptation and resilience? When we face this question on a regular basis, I just like to make sure that we're all beginning in a fairly shared place or on this discussion. Climate change, adaptation, and mitigation are opposite sides of the same coin, which is broadly climate action. When we bring in social equity, we get to hopefully outcomes that include community resilience. So climate adaptation and mitigation plus social equity bring us community resilience. This is a model that I've taken from Movement Strategy Center and has since been used quite extensively across the adaptation and resilience field. Why are we doing this right now, and what is our purpose and our urgency? On my left, hopefully on your left too, this is what I define as the climate adaptation space. This is the space we're in right now. It's a space that is basically 2020 to 2070. We have a high level of certainty about what our climate impacts are going to be during this time. We've been able to model really successfully increases in precipitation, in heat, in severe storms. We know what's going to happen. And we also know that we are in the last phase of time where we can really meaningfully mitigate climate impacts and going into the future. And so in this period, in what I think of as a planning horizon space, we can really be choosing what is the future that we want. We can choose the future that we want, both in terms of how we are secure against the impacts and climate change that are with us, that are guaranteed to come our way. And then we can still bend the curve on where do we want to see our future generations in 2100, 2150 and beyond. This is where all good adaptation includes mitigation in order for us to take advantage of the adaptation space that we're in. Derek, do you want to go to the next slide? And this is a really exciting time to be working on climate change adaptation and resilience. It's an exciting time because the urgency is so high, but also because the partners are really diverse who are coming to the table. We have seen, of course, severe weather events ever increasing. In 2019, there were over $15 billion disasters. I'm not going to give you a headline summary of the disasters that have been with us. Obviously, we rounded the corner on the alphabet of hurricanes this year, the wildfires across the West, the experience of wildfires across the Pacific Northwest, which was surprising and horrifying for people throughout Oregon and Washington, to say nothing of the fires across California and Colorado, and in the upper Great Lakes in the Midwest, in the upper Midwest and the Great Lakes region, the experience of these historic lake levels, which has been catastrophic for infrastructure, for homeowners, and for communities who are trying to understand if these levels are going to persist, if they're going to drop. These impacts are just with us in so many forms. Along with those is a period of time that we're coming into where there has really been previous climate adaptation and resilient infrastructure work put into place, and we're starting to see the measurable result of that work, and that is leading us to be able to see much more concrete examples of the value of resilience. And in cases of resilient infrastructure where There are estimates of $1 spent on resilient infrastructure has an $11 benefit, to more conservative estimates that just came out of a congressional report that was saying $1 of investment gets you $5 of relief. Either way, we know that if we're investing in resilient infrastructure, it's going to benefit us monetarily. We also have a lot more sophisticated cost-benefit analysis tools. One of the more recent tools that came out from an organization called Headwater Economics provides a toolkit of CBAs and ways in which you can evaluate the cost benefit of a project beyond just the monetary, but thinking about environmental services, thinking about equity, thinking about social cohesion, elements of community welfare and environmental welfare that don't necessarily show up in a traditional financial ledger. And so we see both the value being demonstrable of resilience work and also our ability to quantify outside of just dollars and cents, getting to be more sophisticated as well. It's really good that we're starting to quantify things outside of dollars and cents, because the public nonprofit community that's really been at the forefront of this work historically is being overtaken really rapidly by work taking place in corporate risk accounting and an appetite by risk management, by risk disclosure entities to make sure that physical assets and physical risk to assets is being adequately disclosed. So we see risk from CDP, previously called Carbon Disclosure Project, from GRI, and most notably from the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. And what this means is that we are seeing more corporate entities who were initially reporting risk based on what would be our financial risk if we were to take our supply and production and align it to the Paris Accord 2-degree, keeping our carbon footprint under the Paris Accord guidelines. But now what they're starting to report is what is our actual physical risk from climate change. And with corporations disclosing their physical risk publicly, we know that that's going to have an impact on what happens to the municipalities in the states where these corporations are located, because they're talking about their own physical footprint and their own physical spaces, which of course are housed within our publicly managed lands. And it's really important that we're getting alignment between the public and the private sector, so we don't end up with a different set of information on risk coming from the corporate versus coming from what a municipality or other entity is trying to inform both its bond raters, but also its community members about. Just to step back, the name of the organization who's recently released the CBA is Headwaters Economics. And so this last bullet point here is more kind of the same. Many people perked up their ears in January when Larry Fink of BlackRock released a statement on the necessity of climate action by corporations. I'm going to get back to a statement which he actually doubled down on that in May of this year, which a lot of people missed. But in that follow-up statement really drives home that not only is it necessary for us to be adapting our municipalities, our companies, and all of our infrastructures, but that the capital markets and the movement of capital is going to change faster than the impacts of climate will. And really a warning, a very, very clear warning, that if we aren't changing our practices now, the way capital moves is going to change it for us. We also saw an amazing report released from McKinsey this year. They wrote about the physical hazard and social impacts. And if you haven't seen this report, I can't recommend it highly enough. I think it is the best report that's come out of 2020. They talk about physical risk and social risk. They talk extensively about tipping points, and that the impacts from climate change are not going to be linear. We are not just going to continue on a smooth trend, but we are going to reach points in our food systems, in our infrastructure systems, that we suddenly will just not be able to sustain under the changes that are occurring. And so I highly recommend looking at this report from McKinsey. Oh, you can go to the next slide, Derek. So with all of these different actors who are involved, from your disaster declaration to the community that is responding and preparing, who may be impacted, to the companies who are operating, where do they find a home? And that was ASAP's original raison d'etre, is who is working on climate change. And we want to ensure that as this field grows each year, that one, entities coming into the work are not reinventing the wheel. We at ASAP operate as an intermediary organization. We work to really bring together disparate groups who are facing similar challenges, to be uniting them around shared principles, goals, and activities. And while we structure ourselves as a professional society, we operate as a social impact network. And that means that we expect our members, whether you are a member who is working at Microsoft or American Family or Northwest Trust, maybe you're a member who is working at the City of San Francisco or at Little River Band Tribe, that when you come into the network, you have an expectation for open access, reciprocity, trust, and member leadership. And so it is not a transactional organization where you will pay me some money and I will tell you that now you are a climate adaptation professional, go on your way. We expect you to come and interact in the network and to be part of that. And in doing that, ASAP then takes those resources that we develop by hearing and learning from our members, supporting them and connecting them. And we make those things available, because building resilient communities is our end goal. It is not that we are here to just support members. We put a lot of time, energy, and love into the support of our members, but the products that our members create through those processes are things that we think everybody deserves access to. You can go to our next slide, Derek. And our members are, they're all across the country. So we have members in 48 states. We have members in 7 countries. We think of ourselves as a North American network, not just a US network, though our network is dominated by people within the United States. And our membership is increasingly diverse. So we have members that come from all sectors of academia, private, nonprofit, government, and from all types of different backgrounds, from public health to planning to law. And really, it's this diversity that makes the network so rich, and also makes us so capable of ferreting out what is the best work that's happening and trying to make sure that we're replicating that across scales. You can go to the next slide. This is my required slide of organizational members.
Big bed on the floor, or in the big bed on the you'll be up in the big bed, and Papa Gigi will be on the big bed on the floor.
Oh, thanks. So our organizational memberships are one way that members can engage as individuals, or they can engage as organizations. Organizations come from academic institutions, companies, nonprofits, cities, again, and then they bring their staff and clients in to share in this knowledge sharing. Go to the next slide, Derek.
So just a reminder, folks, if you can mute if you're not muted, unless that's Beth's noise, in which case it's perfectly fine. Thanks.
If you can hear piano playing in the back, that's my noise, but.
One of my kids unmuted me.
Go ahead, Beth.
So just a little bit on ASAP programs and activities, the ways in which we actively support our network. We host ASAP member groups. Our member groups are comprised of groups that are democratically selected at the beginning, well, each year, and we're actually going through selection process now. Some of our leading groups include a Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion group. We have a group on climate migration, on networks of networks, a good grief network, and a policy practice network, which are currently meeting. All of these are places where members come together. In some cases, they're doing knowledge sharing. In some cases, they're doing alignment, which is where they are actively working to align their activities with one another on shared purpose. And in some cases, they're doing production. So they're out there to produce a product Our policy practice group has created transition memos for past administrations, policy, advocacy toolkits, that kind of thing. We also have regional hubs where members can meet in person someday, again, like when we meet in person. Yeah, I see this note. The Good Grief Network is really interesting. It's a cohort-based group, so some of these groups you can come in and out of. Good Grief is a cohort. It follows what's called the Good Grief process, which is a 10-step process of learning to identify and address grief. Climate adaptation professionals in their personal work, their professional work and their personal life have a lot of trauma that they see and that they have to accept. Being embedded in this work on a day-to-day basis is taking a very pragmatic, but sometimes really, really sad approach to what is going to happen. You know, we're working to address impacts that already with what we hope to be where we're going in the future. And so the Good Grief Network has been meeting for 2 years. They're going to have a third cohort this year. I think they're actually going to start 2 groups because there is a huge demand, as you may imagine, for it right now. And I think they're, you know, no, I won't speak to what they're doing, but it's, I think I'm really proud of us for having it, and I'm really glad that members are leading it. I'll pause on our careers work, so I'm going to talk a bit about that. We host a magazine. Anybody is welcome to receive our digital magazine. In network, we send out network news, which are updates on leading activities and ways to engage. We host a resource library. And then we have a new ASAP applied research program, which is where we are really housing our migration and climate opportunities work, which I'll chat a little bit more about. Under our adaptation careers, we host a mentorship program. Our mentee docket is full for this year, but we are recruiting mentors. So if you're interested in serving as a mentor, please reach out. We send out jobs and opportunities and host professional training opportunities. If you want to go to the next slide, Derek, I'll talk some about what these professional development resources look like at ASAP. So we have 3 kind of core education tools. One is our code of ethics, which is the baseline. As you come into ASAP as a member, we expect you to be reviewing and accepting the code of ethics. We then have a knowledge and competencies framework, and I'll talk a bit more about that, and our living guide on the principles of adaptation. Go to the next slide. In all of our work and in these as well, they were created really upholding these goals of having cross-sector collaboration. So making sure that the people who are working on this were representative of multiple groups, perspectives, and stakeholders. They're democratic processes, so they are open. They seek input from the full membership, both to create and then review and to comment and improve them. And we ask that they embody our network values, cultivating cultures of trust, and really seeking ways in which we break down traditional organization constraints to understand complex issues. So we can go to the knowledge and competencies framework. Oh, sorry, to the next slide. The knowledge and competencies framework, which Derek has played a critical role in developing, is designed to outline what are the needs, what are the competencies that an adaptation professional needs in order to practice successfully in this field. We understand that people are going to learn and grow through a lot of different opportunities, and we are not trying to become a certifying body at ASAP, but what we are trying to do is help those adaptation professionals who are out there or aspiring to know what do they need to be able to do to practice well in this field. So if you want to go to the next slide, Derek. It includes a summary of key knowledge areas that an adaptation professional ought to be attaining, knowledge that you may gain from lived experience, also from books, articles, or some training. We think that the adaptation and resilience professionals must possess knowledge of each of these concepts and must be able to effectively demonstrate that knowledge. And while one's role will dictate how they have to apply this, we expect that they are areas of universal knowledge that any member or anybody in the field will need to have at least firm and expect to be having a growing grasp of. If you want to go to the next slide, Derek. We then include a list of competencies, and this is about combining knowledge, skills, and abilities to be able to work in a certain way. We include in our framework what sample skills are underneath these competencies. And we expect that adaptation professionals will possess each core competency. We understand that some people may have more strength in one area or another. This is an ongoing journey. We really respect the idea that learning and gaining competency and expertise is not something that's a one and done, especially in today's world, and especially when you're working on climate change. This is not something that is static. And so the learning and the development of competencies is something that is going to be going on throughout your life. It's also why we are reluctant to try to codify this into our own certification versus using this as guidance so that you might go out and identify where there are trainings that are meeting you where you are in your needs to build competencies at whatever phase of the profession you're in. I'm going to go into the living guide next. So Derek, if you want to go to the next slide. The living guide is a synthesis of existing and aspirational principles for ethical, effective, and equitable adaptation practice. The living guide was developed first in 2017, and we've updated it twice since then. Members are always welcome to provide input to the living guide, and it's intended to be a reflection of where we are as a practice and where are we trying to move to. You can go to the next slide. The guide is purposely broad so that it can be applied in any context, and it's meant to really describe the way adaptation is currently practiced and then be a vision for the future. In the introduction of the guide, we talk about these 4 attributes: decision, action, leadership, and power. And we put them in front because as adaptation professionals, typically you are a person who is holding these things. You are likely holding decision power. You're likely in a position of leadership. Your actions are going to influence others. And it's extremely important that you are both aware of the position that you hold and you are thinking about ways in which you release those things, that you share the power with the communities whom you're working with, that your actions are not one directional, but you're creating bidirectional actions where you're receiving information, receiving input, as well as exchanging knowledge and exchanging that leadership role with people whom are impacted by actions which you may be informing or even taking. So at the very front end of Living Guide is a very clear conversation about what we expect from adaptation professionals, and especially from ASAP members, as they go out and engage in adaptation work. Really diversification of power, making sure democratization of power, releasing of power, ensuring that actions are being thought through, communicated, and going in 2 ways. And we do this, next slide, Derek, because the outcomes that we're hoping for, we put these up front, are to enhance adaptive capacity, reduce exposure and sensitivity. You can go to the next slide. And we expect that our members at this point are looking at this list of values, beliefs, strategies, and approaches. And when they see this list, they recognize these strategies in their own work. We are aiming to articulate that effective ethical adaptation practice requires that you use many of these strategies at once, and that there are many ways in which you're going to apply these strategies. The existing best practices think about integration of these into program design, into communication and engagement, and we chose the structure of putting forward what are these strategies and approaches so that people could look at this list and then ask themselves, which ones am I very strong at? Which ones do I need to develop? And how can I use this list, know that I should be practicing all of these in my work, and then build up my individual competencies. And when we run trainings on the Living Guide, we go through this in a really intentional way, helping people to use this list, think about their personal practice or their institution's practice, and then lifting up specific strategies that they want to improve, and then creating basically guidelines for themselves to make their practice more ethical and effective. The last slide is categories for action. Sorry, I keep forgetting that you're advancing slides for me, Derek. Go to the next slide. And we include these categories of action, and they really become kind of the ways in which we hold the strategies that the Living Guide presents. We expect the categories of action to be embodying the different ways in which a professional would act, again, regardless of what sector they may be working in. So from here, I was going to go on into the emerging trends in the adaptation field, but is there any questions before I move away from the Living Guide and the knowledge and competencies framework that folks want to throw out there? Could we explain what, well, so when we think about climate adaptation from a organization perspective, anybody who's integrating future climate information into their day-to-day work. And so, yeah, that could be somebody who is at a Fortune 500, or it could be somebody who's working as a farmer in Honduras. And we would expect them, we would hope that they would be able to find a home and to find knowledge and to find community in ASAP, in the work that ASAP is doing. So it's not so much defining what adaptation is, but rather the way in which we understand what this network is, for whom this network is for. So just a little bit on some emerging trends, and this is going to take us back to talking about the role that the private sector is playing. And I'm not sure how many people here are students or faculty, but maybe in either case, I think as an institution who's preparing students to go out into practice, understanding what is the job market and what does the future look like. As a student who's thinking about your own practice, understanding what are the opportunities, I hope this information will be helpful. You can go to the next slide, Derek. This is the quote, the May 2020 quote that I was referencing earlier from Larry Fink. In this, again, really doubling down from the January statement, which got quite a lot more press, but finishing a long statement and saying, we will see changes in capital allocation more quickly than we see changes in climate itself. In the near future, and sooner than most anticipate, there will be a significant reallocation of capital. And again, I just want to kind of keep this close to heart, because there has been a long time that those of us who've been working on climate adaptation and resilience, and I think all climate action, have wanted to see the private sector step up. And I think that's about to happen. And we need to be prepared and not surprised by it, because this is a lot of momentum. It's a big freight train coming through, and the way in which the tracks are laid is going to define how that train, moves through this field, moves through this community of practice. So next slide, Derek. In 2019, EBI, the Environmental Business Institute, released a report on the climate change adaptation and resilience markets. They profiled 45 adaptation and resilience firms, and they identified the market value of those firms and their climate adaptation and resilience markets at $650 million, with 350 million being in risk assessment and another 300 in adaptation and resilience planning. You can go to the next slide, Derek. You can learn more. Oh, thanks for putting that Larry Fink letter there. When they're defining the adaptation and resilience industry, they're defining it by climate change adaptation services, disaster services, and adaptation equipment systems. And you can learn more about those industry definitions. I'll send these slides out. I'm sorry, I didn't do that before, so I'll send them out when we're done. But you can follow a link there to industry definitions. You can go to the next slide, Derek. Just a little bit here on what does that mean and what is the change that we're seeing in the adaptation and mitigation consulting space. So as we look from 2004 up to 2020, so the 2020s being projected, Obviously, the consulting space was heavily dominated by mitigation and compliance consulting, and suddenly we see this emergence of the adaptation and resilience consulting space. I think that my personal perspective on what's going to happen as we come through this economic downturn that we've been led into through the pandemic is probably a continuation of this trend. Local governments are shedding staff, unfortunately, but this work is still going to need to get done in one way or another. And so the likely home for a lot of people who want to be practicing in adaptation and resilience is going to be going into the corporate sector in either large or small consulting firms. You can go to the next slide. Here again, we see the consulting and contracting and how this portion of the market has been increasing, specifically looking at consulting in the engineering industry. And we can hop to this next slide, Derek. And I want to go from this slide. This is more of the McKinsey report, just down to the next slide. Just a little bit as we're thinking forward, ASAP has been taking a role now in a new applied research area of migration and what's happening with climate-informed migration. The reason that ASAP has come into this is there was clearly conversations happening around managed retreat and migration away from coastal areas, but it felt like there was a dearth of conversations around what would happen with communities who would be receiving population. And so myself, being located in Michigan, having a history working on resilience across the Great Lakes region, including the 8 states and the province of Ontario, it felt to me that this was a topic we really needed to be addressing. And so ASAP started working on this from the perspective of the Great Lakes first, and thinking about how this region with its 30 million people, with 60 million people across the Great Lakes, 30 million people who live in the Mississippi River Basin, which obviously starts in the Great Lakes region, or in a Great Lakes state anyway, in Minnesota. Already the Great Lakes have 5 out of the 10 leading ag states, 160 million tons of cargo transported annually across the lakes. What will happen as we start to see people who are in climate risk areas ask the question of where should we go? And if you want to go down to the next slide, Derek. Some of the reasons why we think that this is an important question to be asking is that we already know there's about 800,000 people who live in neighborhoods who are presently exposed to flooding. There could be as many as 45 million people living in neighborhoods that flood at least once per year under 3 feet of sea level rise, which is highly anticipated. We know there will be at least 13 million people by 2100 who are living in homes that will be underwater. They will not live underwater. We also know that there are 40 million people who are dependent on the Colorado watershed, which gets its water from Lake Powell and Lake Mead, which have not recharged over 50%. So as we look around, we can see this obvious need, this obvious pressure that is cooking around the country where people will not be able to stay where they are. And so we started working on this tantalizing question of, will they come here, and combining demographic and climate scientists to look at how do we change demographic models to be dynamic and to be future looking. And it's been a really terrific project so far, one that we're running into many of the same problems that we've run into historically as we've tried to bring climate data into engineering and other fields, that so many sciences rely on historic data. They beg for stationarity, and that is just not what climate change gives us. And so taking demographic models and actually having them become living, bringing climate change models and demographic models to make them be living and breathing and changing is a new and a really exciting challenge, and one that we're going to be working on over the next several of years. So yeah, you can go ahead and pop to the next slide. I have this, you didn't ask for this, Derek, but I put it in anyway. What we need from higher ed institutions. We need higher ed institutions to integrate facility management with community activities so that higher ed institutions are being champions for good adaptation and resilience in their communities. We need to make sure higher ed institutions set standards with future climate information built into capital improvement projects. Higher ed institutions often have exemptions from what communities or municipalities might set, and we need them to not take advantage of those exceptions. We need to align the institution with the resilience and standards and plans coming from the community, and worked with community-based resilience and emergency management teams to understand the role that the institution can play. It may be as a refuge, it may be as a communication center, it may be as just showing up to give more authority to the activities that the community is leading. And then we need a model of holistic systems thinking, integrating facilities and operations and academic programs, hosting interdisciplinary research teams on campus projects, and really giving students a place to get their hands dirty on these questions before they're released out kind of into the wild. Academic institutions have huge footprints and facilities and things that need resilience thinking. Giving students an opportunity to test their ideas in their home base is something that we need to do better, instead of sometimes giving them a community to be a lab, which can lead to a lot of deleterious effects. So that was longer, I don't know what time I started at. You didn't shake any hooks at me. You can hop down. It's a little bit about how to join ASAP as individuals. We have pay what you can model. So anybody who wants to be part of this network is able to make it happen. And if you want to go to the last slide. Is there one more slide that you have in your deck? Or is that it? That's it. Yeah, that's my last slide.
Okay, great. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing the screen. Sorry about the pop-ups. Is that fine, Beth?
Oh yeah, that's fine.
Okay, great. So let's go ahead and hear any questions from anybody. Fire away.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Melissa.
So I am working on, sorry, I just gotta get in a quiet spot. I am working on adaptation and resilience to climate for older adults as a particularly vulnerable demographic to climate change. And I was wondering if you knew of any people or organizations or papers or anything like that looking at that field also.
Yes, I do. I had an amazing conversation with a woman whose name is Nicole Kane. She's a PhD student. I think her name is Nicole Kane. Let me make sure I got this right. Yeah, her name is Nicole Kane. She's a PhD student at Antioch University right now, but she has this incredible history. She was an occupational therapy, a geriatric occupational therapist in her first career, and now has come back to getting a PhD looking at how we make, there's a jargon term for it that I can't remember right now, retirement destination, RDIs, retirement destination places, prepared for a graying population. And she and I just met because she was interested in the climate migration work that we're doing and what is taking place, especially in the upper Midwest, where the retirement has often meant people leave. And there are parts of the country which are actually very well suited, like the Sun Belt basically grew on retirees. And so have better facilities for the aging versus people who are now trying to age in place, either because they have to or because they're actually choosing to age in place in the upper Midwest. I'd be more than happy to connect you with Nicole. She's just starting her PhD, but her background is so great because she's done the occupational therapy work and now is bringing this climate lens in a question of how do we study and actually prepare communities for these people, and she really knows what they need. So yeah.
Yeah, that would be great if you could connect us. Yep. I'll throw my email in the chat.
Perfect.
I've got a question.
Yeah.
Hey, Beth, Alex Hurley, an alum of the Boynton School, and currently working for a group called Donovan Energy in Cincinnati. Among other things, we do consulting with a number of nonprofit organizations studying the energy sector, focused on mitigation primarily, and we are looking at investments of electric utilities as a one of the big things that we're focusing on, how finance is allocated. And when I was interested when you said that, thinking about BlackRock announcement that there might be a big reallocation of capital in the future, and we need to be prepared for that. Can you speak a little bit more to what you think that preparation looks like, and how that might go well or poorly?
I would recommend to any utility to be looking at TCFD as a guideline. Like, what are the TCFD guidelines for disclosure? Because I think that is going to be the first question that capital asks is, do you know what your risk is? And are you aligning your understanding of risk with what is being used in the financial market? And I don't know an electric utility that has done that, but I know that water utilities are doing it now. There's a WRF project that assessed risk for business lines across 6 water utilities in the US. I'd be happy to send you that report. And I don't know that they used a TCFD outline, but the person who was a core member of that team is Emily Wasley, who's at WSP and leads their Future Readies program, and she's their TCFD lead at WSP. So like, if it wasn't a TCFD process, it would have been very TCFD aligned. I'd be happy to introduce you to her, and I'd be happy to share with you the WRF, Water Utilities Risk Disclosure Project.
Great, thank you.
Risk assessment. It wasn't a disclosure project. I can say it was risk assessment. Oh, somebody asked, what is TCFD? Sorry, climate, it's the task force. It's got, more words than actually, task force on climate related financial disclosures. This was initiated in, maybe 2015 by Bloomberg. And it's an international standard. It's a framework for disclosing risk. And it was designed for and is being taken up by corporations, by global corporations. That's the short version of it. If you Google it, you can learn more about it. To somebody, if you've been practicing climate change adaptation and resilience in a municipal setting for any amount of time, and you look at TCFD, you're gonna be like, oh, it's not really new. It's just a new group of people. And for whatever reason, it is made this wave of action. I don't know if I should say it. I have to say that, like, if you've practiced climate adaptation and resilience, if you've helped a community go through the process of identifying their strengths, their climate risk, their resources, and their way that they want to address it, looking at TCFD guidelines isn't like you're going to see something you've never seen before. It's just a really interesting, it's become the way that the corporate world has brought risk disclosure, climate risk disclosure into their, I don't know, their view.
Hey, Beth, can I answer a question right now? Can you just do a minute on what you think the value of ASAP is for a student?
The value of ASAP for a student is really, really high. So those member-led interest groups, which I discussed, which convene on a monthly basis, typically have co-chairs and often subgroups. Being involved in the member-led interest group is an amazing way to connect across the adaptation community. It's an opportunity for you to really build up your leadership skills. It's a way for you to become much more competent at meeting facilitation, running conversations across diverse groups. And it also ensures that you have both a network and a knowledge on key areas of climate. You also can participate in the process. So what groups do you want? You can recommend them, you can vote for them, you can bring your friends to vote for them. And then you get ASAP staff support to also help you to have those conversations. So those member groups have a huge value. The trainings have a huge value. We've hosted both virtual, of course, we used to do our in-person living guide trainings as a way for you to think about maybe a project or something you've worked on and you want to think about those values and strategies and which ones you're competent in and which ones you want to build. And then in the before times, as ASAP members, you get discounts at any of the national and regional adaptation conferences and at a bunch of other events. And so there's a real monetary benefit to being part of ASAP that you would get from a lot of, other professional societies. But actually, I should say, Derek, we don't run NAF, actually. ASAP doesn't run NAF. Now, EcoDep runs NAF. No. But as an ASAP member,
you are why I go. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, right. But you do get a discount to NAF as an ASAP member. So we have a complementary relationship. Those are a few reasons. It's also just, if you want to work in climate adaptation, it's the best network of people to connect with and to learn from.
If I could ask a question, Beth, thank you. This has been very helpful. I'm interested in strategies you've had to bridge some of the political language and kind of how people come to the topic, and whether that excludes them because of kind of knee-jerk notions that they're not supposed to engage on that. So I guess the first question would be, is that highly publicized and assumed divide around climate and one party for it, one party against taking it seriously, is that something that you find? And second, if there are elements of that, do you have particular strategies or languages or terms that you're using to engage audiences that may have an initial hesitancy to engage because of kind of the language of politics rather than the substance of what's happening on the ground?
Yeah, that's a good question. So ASAP has never hid the fact that we work on climate change. And I will say that for me, having come from University of Michigan and working across the Midwest and across Midwest communities, I have worked on adaptation by stealth in my career, and I understand why we do that. At ASAP, we have worked on climate change explicitly, and we've never hid the punchline about it. I will say that over the last year, too, ASAP members developed and published a justice, equity, diversity, inclusion statement. And ASAP works on climate and we work on justice. And those are not words that make everybody comfortable. And that is okay with us. We've come to that decision. The group that formed ASAP before I was here came to the decision that if climate is not something you're comfortable with, this may not be the group for you. If justice is not something you're comfortable with, this may not be a group you're ready for yet. We understand that our members work in places where they may not be able to have a climate parade. And that's not what we're asking for them to do. We support members to find language that is meaningful in the places where they work. And that is part of being effective as a listener. And that idea of like action is reciprocal, leadership is reciprocal, decision-making is reciprocal. You can't come in and build resilience by demanding that people do something that they find antithetical to who they are. However, at ASAP, as an organization, we work on climate change and we work on justice, and those are principles that we hold up all the time. I have some personal opinions that I can't stop always saying to people. At a state and federal legislators, to me, do not get the benefit of a feigned ignorance about a global crisis. I have more patience for local decision makers, community members who aren't ready to talk about climate change for whatever reason. But it's essentially, to me, like depending on how many lives depend on you, like you need to be willing to talk about the reality that we're in. I'm not the person that they send to all the meetings, incidentally.
It takes a village, right? I mean,
it does. Yep, it does. It takes a village. Yeah, I can drink a beer with anyone, but I mean, it was definitely like when I traveled more, it was always interesting who I would end up talking with in airports and how many people don't believe in climate change, which is very easy to miss when you're doing this work all day. But I've exchanged some books and some letters with some climate deniers over the years after talks in an airport bar. So
But what is critical is that we have legislators who are totally unknowledgeable, and certainly in our Ohio State House. And the ramifications of that are tremendous. So it's really quite a serious issue. We have legislators who are refusing to mask in chamber yesterday. So it's pretty terrible.
Yeah. As I said, I mean, I'm not the best. I don't want to say this wrong. I'm not the best peacemaker. Like I really believe that there are people who are responsible for knowing the reality of where we're acting. And if you try to act on climate change and you don't call it climate change, then you start putting band-aids on things. You just push the problem to somebody else. You just push the problem to another system. And that's the issue with that's the issue with adaptation by stealth. When you just slip it into your stormwater plan, you just try to slip it in here or there, is that like it comes out someplace else. These are systems, they're interconnected. And yeah, I mean, I'm disgusted in Michigan right now with our legislators and with many of my fellow, I guess, Michiganders. It's horrifying. And it does not give me a lot of confidence in climate action, to be completely frank. We need a serious change of public and political will to take action on things that are existential threats to all of us.
So any last minute questions? We are at time. So for those who have to go, you are allowed. Does anybody have a burning question they want to end with?
I don't know if it's burning. I have one, but I don't want to. I've already had my chance. Beth, I'd love to know if you have, or what your assessment is of the struggle of adaptation versus mitigation rather than adaptation and mitigation, and whether particularly those historical rationale for we don't adapt because it'll undercut the momentum for the imperative for mitigation. From my perspective, a self-defeating false choice. But I wonder if that's something that you're still facing as you engage even those who take climate quite seriously, but want to keep the focus and the attention and the money on the mitigation side.
Yeah, unfortunately, yes. That's the short answer. Funding is over 80% of all global philanthropic funding for climate is for mitigation. And the urgency, which was born out of the 2019 climate strike and Greta Thunberg's movement, I actually felt a resurgence of the mitigation versus adaptation debate, which was extremely discouraging. Not because of her, right? This is like not her, but like people, like that sense of urgency. I'm raising a bunch of small kids, and like I say, you have to be able to pat your head and rub your belly. Like we're beyond, like adaptation as a field is beyond that you can work in siloed solutions. And it is time for us to do this together. I will say that personally, in my personal practice as a member of the climate adaptation field, coming through COVID-19, one of the things that has struck me is the public health sector's ability to not quibble on prevention versus treatment, in that you should be wearing a mask and we're also buying ventilators. Like you need both. And I think that we as a whole field, and that counts me too, need to be better at making the case all the time for prevention and treatment as part of the whole body of work. So I see a call for everyone, including art and adaptation and resilience professionals, to be better at working on all sides of climate action.
Great. Thank you so much, Beth. We're at a little over time, so I'm going to go ahead and call it for the meeting. Thank you again for presenting.
Thanks, Derek. Thanks for inviting me so much.
For reminding me why I would follow you into battle any day. If anybody has any other follow-ups with Beth, but feel free to drop her a note. And I highly encourage students and professionals alike to grab a membership because it's a great group to work in. You see just ideas, really smart people doing great work. So a great way to engage out there. Thank you, everybody. And Beth, thanks so much.
No problem. Thank you, Derek. Have a great Thanksgiving, everybody.
And you too. Bye.
By
all.
yourselves.
Thank you.
With your Cornish
Thank you.
hen.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Welcome.
Thank you, Beth. Bye.